All right, I think we'll begin. Welcome, everybody. Really delighted that you're all here with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to welcome you to New Approaches to Contemporary Art at deCordova. And this is another exciting webinar in the ongoing series offered by the trustees. And as a reminder, just before we begin, you will have a chance to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you send your questions in, we'll gather them, and then there are various moments throughout the presentation when we'll pause to answer questions. So rest assured that we will get to those, but go ahead and type them into the Q&A feature whenever you think of them. And also, we'll encourage your participation in a couple of poll questions that may pop up from time to time. And I think that'll be pretty self-explanatory. You'll select an answer, and then click submit. Next slide, please. There we go. So my name is John Ravenall, and I am the trustee's Vice President for Arts and Culture and Artistic Director at deCordova. And as many of you know, I came to deCordova in 2015 as Executive Director and joined the trustees as Vice President for Arts and Culture in 2019 when deCordova integrated with the trustees. That was just this past July. So today, we are planning to discuss contemporary art at deCordova, and I will begin with an overview of the program. And then my colleague, Sarah Montross, will speak in greater depth on one upcoming exhibition. So let me just jump right in with an overview. deCordova's curatorial program, broadly speaking, has three parts. And one part, which I won't talk about today, is the collection, which consists of 3,500 works in all media. That means sculpture, painting, photography, drawings, prints, and video. Next slide. I will pause to talk about the park. So this is a second part of the curatorial program at deCordova. The park is almost 30 acres, 28.4 to be exact, and there are around 50 to 60 works on view at any given time. And most of the works in the park are part of the permanent collection. And that includes this piece that you're seeing here in the snow, which is a classic cement block tower by the founder of American conceptual art, Sol DeWitt, who also happened to be a New England-based artist. Next slide. And the park, in addition to the permanent collection, the park also features important loans. And these come to us from other museums, from sculpture parks, from galleries, from collectors, and sometimes directly from artists. And they remain at deCordova anywhere from 2 years to over 20 years in one case. And the works that you're seeing here, these wonderfully colorful animated works, are by the Los Angeles-based artist Aaron Curry, a younger mid-career artist. And they were lent to us several years ago after being displayed at Lincoln Center Plaza in New York. And they will actually be leaving us next spring to be replaced by something else, even bolder and more colorful. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Next slide. So sticking with the park, another category of work that is outdoors in the park are temporary commissions. So at any given time, there are 3 to 5 temporary commissions in the park, and these are part of our platform series. And for these, we invite artists, generally emerging and mid-career artists, and they can be from New England, national, or international. And we invite them to come and make new work that responds to the property in some way. So that could be our history, the landscape, the collection, the architecture, any way that they want to respond to the setting. And what you're seeing here are turret tops by the Brooklyn-based artist Lisa Mexon. And these are actually exact replicas in their size and their shape of the turrets that are on top of deCordova's historic building. But of course, you can see they're made of colorful stretch fabric which is over metal armatures. And these have been on view for around a year and are due to come down at the end of the summer or early fall. Next slide. We also, on occasion, very periodically, commission new site-specific work that we intend to be featured permanently at deCordova. And this was the case most recently with Andy Goldsworthy's Watershed. So deCordova actually first engaged Goldsworthy back in 2010 for this project. And there were engineering difficulties, there were leadership changes at deCordova, and it actually created a 10-year timeline before completion. And this is actually the longest in Goldsworthy's experience for any of his commissions. We did finally complete the piece last summer, and we are delighted to say that we are the only public institution in New England with a Goldsworthy commission. There are some in private collections, but this is the only public Goldsworthy in New England. And you can see it's a granite shed. It's built into the hillside, facing the pond. And when it rains, all the water from the upper parking lot at deCordova is channeled and flows underground through pipes and pours forth from that hole that you see in the center back wall in the midst of those wonderful concentric granite rings. So it's a beautiful piece and a reason to visit deCordova in the rain. Next slide. So in addition to the collection and the park, the third major aspect of deCordova's curatorial program is the museum. And this consists of 6 galleries equal to around 10,000 square feet with changing exhibitions. And the exhibitions change in 2 cycles per year, and each cycle generally includes 1 to 4 separate exhibitions. So deCordova is known as a museum with a strong curatorial voice. That's something I really am proud about deCordova. And what that means is that almost all of our exhibitions are organized in-house, and that they combine substantial intellectual content with broad public appeal. That's something we've been very intentional about. On the rare occasion when we take an exhibition that originated elsewhere, we often work directly with the artist to reconfigure it for deCordova. So the current round of exhibitions, which were just about to be deinstalled when COVID struck, are all photography exhibitions. We wanted to make it a moment for photography. And the kind of umbrella title for that is photosynthesis. And what you're seeing in this image is one of the 3 exhibitions, a beautiful show, which was curated by Sarah and explores the influence of early 20th century photographer Karl Blossfeldt on the photographers who followed him right up to the present moment. Next slide. And this is one of the other of the 3 exhibitions that are still installed in the gallery. It is a very timely and imaginative show called Truthiness and the News. And this was curated by our Koch curatorial fellow, Sam Adams, and it explores the concept of fact and fiction and distortion of reality in reporting the news and imagery. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, one last aspect of deCordova's curatorial program that I'd like to mention are the programs. So the curatorial department organizes numerous lectures, tours, public conversations, and also 2 signature programs each year. And one is the Rappaport Prize Lecture, which is presented by the prize-winning recipient of the $35,000 Rappaport Prize that deCordova has awarded annually since 2000. And the other, which I'm showing you an image here, is the Paul J. Cronin Memorial Lecture. So this is also an annual event, and this is generally in the spring. We've pushed it back a little, this current one, to the early summer. And this year, as you can see, it's featuring a rare opportunity to visit the studios by Zoom of 2 internationally acclaimed artists, Mark Dion and Dana Sherwood, in their home in upstate New York. And you can see that the date is on here, Wednesday, June 24th at 6:30. And I encourage you to note that in your calendar, and we'll be happy to follow up on this talk with the invitation if you don't already have it, so you can get the Zoom link. So next slide. In just a moment, I will introduce Sarah. But before I do, I want to just pause and see if there are any, actually before I ask for any questions, we have a quick pop-up poll for you. So what is your favorite location in the sculpture park? Is it the roof deck and the views from above? Is it Jim Dime's Big Black Hearts? Is it, which you see pictured here? Is it Andy Goldsworthy's Watershed? Or is it inside one of the magnificent weeping beech trees near the entrance to the park? So go ahead and choose one of those and hit submit. And within about 45 seconds, we will have a response. I'm going to submit my own answer. Sarah, I encourage you to submit. We could be the ringers here, I guess. Oh, look at that. Okay. So by percentages, there was a tie between the roof deck and views from above and Jim Dime's Big Black Hearts. Andy, whoa, that went away quickly. But there we go. Andy, the Watershed at 12. Oh no, it's a three-way tie inside the weeping beech trees. Okay, interesting. This is good consumer research for us. Thank you. Okay, let's take that away. And were there any questions? I believe that Annika might read those out. Is that right?
That's correct. We do have some questions. So
Okay.
The first question, John, is, are you planning for any future collaboration between the two trustees' museums, deCordova and Fruitlands, or any other trustees' properties?
Oh, that's a great question. And the simple answer is yes. You know, it's really the purpose, or let's say the opportunity in integrating deCordova with the trustees was to enhance the arts and culture profile of the trustees. The trustees have been committed to culture, of course, since their founding in 1891, but this is the first time there's been a separate arts and culture division. And so this is to build capacity and to integrate all the different functions across the state. So we definitely are planning to have, especially the two museums, Fruitlands and deCordova, be more closely aligned. That doesn't mean that they'll in any way sacrifice their individuality, but it means more coordination. And it could even mean, and keep your eyes out for this, it could even mean in the future that there may be exhibitions that occur at both locations at the same time, a single exhibition split between two sites. So we are actively in the midst of conversation about that. Were there any other questions, Annika?
Yes, we have two more.
Okay.
When will the newly commissioned Rachel Mickelweiss piece arrive at deCordova?
I should have that date right on my fingertip, but it is, the piece is actively being constructed, and it will be installed this summer for sure. I believe it's in July. I don't have the exact date. We can follow up on that to give you an exact date, but it is actively in process. Next
All right,
question.
and then the last question is, how has deCordova been planning for reopening the indoor galleries to the public?
Yeah, so you know that deCordova is open out in the park. That happened about 2 weeks ago, and it's been going really well, both in terms of being sold out on a regular basis and people behaving responsibly, keeping their physical distance. And now we're in conversation across the trustees to address when we can reopen the galleries at Fruitlands and deCordova and the historic houses. So there's no set timeline, and there are many, many moving parts that have to happen in terms of safety protocols and also deinstalling and reinstalling new exhibitions. So I suspect we're thinking about, we're really aiming toward the early fall, September, October. Okay, so just keeping with this slide for a sec, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce my colleague, Sarah Montross. who will take you through in greater depth one exhibition that she's been working on for several years. Sarah arrived at deCordova 4.5 years ago and has curated a number of very thoughtful, deeply researched, and beautiful exhibitions. She's also published important contributions to the scholarly literature on contemporary art, helped build the collection, created numerous inspiring programs, and today she'll speak about the upcoming exhibition, Visionary New England. And I want to say, I think Sarah will mention this, but we're quite proud that she was awarded 3 prestigious grants for this, from the Luce Foundation, the Warhol Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. So that's just a testament to the substantial scholarly nature of this show, which also I think will have broad public appeal. So let me turn it over to Sarah now.
Thank you, John. It's so nice to be here and have a chance to talk about what it means to be a contemporary curator at deCordova and now as part of the trustees. I haven't had really a chance to do that since the shutdown, of course. So it's just a really refreshing moment for us. Thank you. I'm going to move us into the next slide. So I'm going to share with you some of the behind the scenes research and ways in which I arrived at an exhibition called Visionary New England that opens this fall. And I thought I could use this exhibition as a way to talk about what it means for me developing as a curator at a very specific place at deCordova that has a very specific sense of place, the landscape, the history, its connections to New England, its proximity to Walden, and many of the other dynamics that relate to its social and political histories. And so this is a project that for me points to new directions of both how you can work as a curator outside, inside, and think about the kind of ways in which histories and moments stay within a landscape and how artists then respond to it today. And so I think a lot about contemporary art in a way in which that continues the legacies of past moments. And so this is just one example of that. It's an exhibition that I started working on about 3 years ago. So it was also prior to the integration with the trustees, but it was really powerful to think about the integration while I was putting the sort of final touches on this exhibition, because in a lot of ways, the connections between art, culture, and nature that are so mission central to the trustees were already on my mind with this exhibition. And the trustees often talk about developing a sense of place of each location. And like I said, I think this is an exhibition that does that broadly across New England, and then specifically for deCordova. So Visionary New England is an exhibition that's inspired by New England's utopian and spiritualist histories. So in the 19th century, a number of intentional communities form, often in agrarian settings, short-lived, of course, to improve their way of life and to live communally. And these were societies of dreamers, eccentrics, but also regular folk who just were seeking a better way of living. And so that moment and these activities really appealed to me as I learned more about them. The exhibition starts there, but it then really is featuring the work of 10 contemporary artists, including a work like what you see on the right, artists like Caleb Charland, who I started to consider as maybe inheritors of some of these earlier 19th century traditions. And so again, it's a way in which we're moving back and forth in time. And some of these artists respond directly to their past moments, and some of these artists are less directly doing so, but I feel like the spirit of their work and the ways in which they talk about it, the language of these ideas kind of have, they're carrying the same ideas that, that these earlier practitioners did. So just as Iris described, the intent of this exhibition is to, start at a specific time, 19th century, but also to move forward in time and understand how ideas, utopian seekers, visionary thinkers, how those ideas, which often truthfully are short-lived, either they're very grand and they can't sustain themselves, or they're not yet accepted, they're ahead of their time, but some pieces of them do move forward in time. And so I'm interested in that, that action as well, like in the next generation of creators, thinkers, who are those that inherit and shape such that we might see this movement of creative action over a period, over decades. So the exhibition is a chance for me to put together contemporary art alongside historic artifacts. I mean, more often we see contemporary artists being invited to curate at historic homes or in places where you're trying to liven up a historic place that maybe is a little dusty and it needs some reinterpretation. I thought it would be interesting in this case to bring historic work into a contemporary art setting and build out a moment of exploring when you bring a historic older artifact into a contemporary setting, how can you make that look brand new and strange and interesting again? Through the course of this exhibition, I've also identified a large array of sites that I consider to be quote unquote visionary, which have a really broad definition. I'd be happy to talk about what that means in the Q&A period or any time if you're curious. But many of these sites are some of these sites are ones I visited. Some are sort of shut, they've closed, they've had a lifespan that then doesn't exist anymore. But the ones, the works that are listed in the locations listed in the lighter blue are ones that are still functioning, still have activity. And so that's really interesting to me that across New England, you have many places where the idea of visionary New England still exists in my mind. This is actually an older map I'm showing you. In fact, the map that I'll be showing in the exhibition has many more sites and locations, but you'll notice these 3 red stars in the northern part of Massachusetts. And that's because through the course of this exhibition planning, I was able to coordinate or collaborate with the curators both at the Fitchburg Art Museum and at Fruitlands. So both curators, Shayna Dumont-Gar at Fruitlands and Lisa Crossman, formerly of the Fitchburg Art Museum, organized their own exhibitions with related topics around themes of utopianism and spiritualism. Spiritualism, by the way, is kind of a popular philosophy from the 19th century that where people would be participating in seances or other forms of almost like telepathic communication to connect with their deceased loved ones. So it's sort of movements that surround those ideas of talking and communicating with those beyond our material realm. And so it had a real foothold here in New England, and still today there's aspects of spiritualism that are in practice. And of course, Fruitlands is an important center foundational point of action in terms of the utopian communities within New England, as Fruitlands was its own experiment founded by Charles Lane and Bronson Alcott in 1843, I believe, And like John mentioned, we've been really fortunate, and this is one of the benefits of working at a museum like deCordova, and to have some time to devote to exhibitions like this, that through the research and through repeated applications, we're able to get a large sum of funding for this exhibition. And that allowed me to do something which I haven't really had the chance yet here at deCordova, a major catalog. So this will be co-distributed by MIT Press, designed by Lucia Marquand. I commissioned 5 essays by connected scholars and 2 of the artists in the exhibitions, and some of the resources that I've mentioned and many more are also embedded within this text. So much of the work that I'm about to drill a little deeper into that you may not experience on the walls, or but would be available if you're interested in these topics, that some of that material is within this book. And so contemporary curating, as many of you know, if you're familiar with what that means, it's like you put together an exhibition and so many other ideas and directions and loose winding roads like kind of drift away, and there's an exhibition in physical form. But the benefit of working on a catalog like this allows you to a wider platform to share some of those earlier ideas and conversations. So really glad we're able to put that together. Just to show, before I get into kind of the process of working on this exhibition, just a few examples of the type of artwork on view. Kim Weston is a photographer, installation artist based in New Haven. All of the 10 artists, I would say, either have connections to New England because they live in the area, or their projects directly relate to this visionary history that I mentioned. They may not live here. But Kim is of Mohawk heritage. She and her wife attend powwows on a regular basis with their children. And in that setting, Kim gets really close to the ground, and has developed this form of photography in which she shoots the performers who are in their full costume regalia. And using an open shutter and her methods of photographing, the physical form of the performer dissolve, and they become kind of this dematerial spirit in a sense. And that is really the case of Kim's work, that she thinks about the spiritual energy and this sense of communing with one's ancestors, with those beyond who were there before her. And the photographs, to her, this technological process is one that can adequately and sort of magically convey this movement of time and energy and space. So it's a really interesting, beautiful, transcendent looking body of work. Another artist in this exhibition, Paul Lawfully, was a founder of an organization called the Boston Visionary Cell. So he's clearly someone we needed to have in this exhibition. He's for decades worked, he's passed away recently, but for decades worked on paintings like what you see on the left, which are almost like diagrams for understanding his different interests in theosophies and alternative belief systems, in extraterrestrial communication, many different forms of, I would say, ways of gaining knowledge outside of canonical academic study, perhaps. And some of these paintings act as like diagrams for if you can read the text and put these images together, they will also deliver you to a higher state of mind. So there's often a kind of action as a viewer to bring you to this, this new knowledge, essentially. Less a representation of another world, but more a way to bring you somewhere else. And he wrote extensively on themes of utopia, like this document you see on the right, Utopic Space, from 1992. The painter Angela Dufresne, to me, was an interesting, really one of the most interesting contemporary painters of our time, who was painting scenes of people convening in outdoor spaces, rather cryptically, but suggestive to me of the kind of world building of the 19th century that was happening at places like Fruitlands or Brook Farm, where you have multi-generations of people trying to build a new world. It's strange and in formation in a way, and I think her way of painting, this lack of resolution and some of the brush strokes and so forth, actually suggests something that's far more mutable than something fixed. And to that, and Angela thinks about ideas of utopian searching as something that will never be achieved, never be finished, that kind of work. And so all of that is kind of embedded into her large scale paintings. And then lastly, I wanted to mention one of the other artists in the exhibition, for those of you familiar with the earlier efforts of the trustees in commissioning large scale commissions outdoors, they commissioned Sam Durant's Meeting House project, which is at the Old Manse in Concord in 2016, this pavilion that was the platform for convenings around themes of racial justice, history, and connections between Black Americans and transcendentalists. And other issues around Boston's loaded history and Concord's in particular. So the formation of that floor that Sam created, that pavilion, you can see actually formed a house. So as you see on the right, when he got back to Los Angeles, he had in his mind to build a body of work based off this project he had done in Concord. One of the artworks is this house. And so we're bringing a portion of the house back across the United States to show in deCordova's gallery. So you'll see a portion of the wall upright. And it's a way to bring us back in a way to Sam's work. In particular, Sam's project was one, I think, of historic, I would call it a kind of sculptural practice of historic reenactment, where he is studying and in some cases almost exactly replicating loaded material objects from places like the Old Manse, in this case Emerson's writing chair, and then a desk by the very first African-American published poet, Phyllis Wheatley. He in his studio got the exact measurements and colors and so forth of these two pieces of furniture while they were in Concord and residence through the trustees. And then when they got back to their studio, as you see on the left, Sam worked on a body of work in which he made these two material objects kind of violently intersect, and powerfully so. And so Emerson's chair is now held up, supported by Phyllis as an African-American woman, is really the foundation of in this sort of interpretation of a form of literature that then other writers come to inherit. And so the point of this work is to kind of bring lesser commonly told histories together, transcendentalism and the work of Phyllis Wheatley, and kind of bringing them in dialogue. The exhibition is a pretty wide-ranging one, as you can already tell. There's a lot of different ways in which people are working, and I'm also weaving within it. And I want the show to feel eccentric, because I do believe that New England is filled of eccentrics, and their stories are important. And so there's also historic objects by artists and just visual culture, including like a sculpture by Harriet Hosmer, who was born and passed away in Watertown, Massachusetts, but is in fact considered within the United States the first female professional sculptor. And so she really had a very prominent active life as a neoclassical sculptor in the mid 19th century, and sculpted works like what you see here, Hesper, the Evening Star, inspired by a kind of figurative form portrait bust of this nighttime figure. And so this dream state kind of is suggested by alluding to an allegorical figure like Hesper. Hosmer herself actually was also visited by spirits, and she wrote in her journals of spiritualist practices that she was participating in. And so there's a direct connection in that case to both the sculpture she's creating and her own activities on the side, not as an artist, but as a believer. Or on the right, you see an example of from the Fruitlands Museum collection. So we are collaborating with Fruitlands already, in fact. And in this case, this is a Millerite banner. So the Millerites are those who believed in the second coming of Christ that would bring about, an apocalyptic an event, but also save those who are believers. And this chart, with all its numbers and figures and different diagrammatic elements, explain in numeric, sort of an arithmetic form, how and when and why the apocalypse would occur. And it was meant to occur in 1843. So you can see those years, 1843 at the top right. It's a really fascinating, strange, and rich thing to study. And so that idea of apocalypse, which was so present in the 1840s, it was 1840s, as I mentioned, is sort of the origin point of this exhibition. It was a time of both utopian communities forming and apocalyptic prophecy. So at the very moment in which people are perceiving the end of the world, people are trying to build new ones. And to me, it's striking that we are now living in a period of time in 2020, especially right now, that we are feeling a similar moment of the world in many ways changing, and we have to build and come up with new ways of thinking and conceiving of structures, institutions, potentially our habits, and the ways in which we are living. And so I really feel like a show like Visionary New England has, if it didn't already have meaning and importance prior to COVID and prior to the Black Lives Matter protests, I think it really does. And I hope it does convey that now, that these issues and the ways in which they can be solved and talked about continue. So with the time I have left, I have about 10 minutes. I'm going to walk us through a few ways in which I started working on this subject. So I know that when people come into exhibitions, it looks like a very clean, for those who've worked, maybe in the audience who've worked on exhibitions or any kind of involved presentation, the process of the process behind the scenes and its way of coming into fruition is never neat. It's very winding and rarely, yeah, there's no immediate way to know you're starting it. But for me, it started while on vacation in Tenants Harbor, Maine. I was lucky enough to rent this beautiful cabin and with friends. And while sitting outside at a scene like this, I started talking about, we all started talking about what were the histories and legacies of New England's culture and history that were less commonly told. Like New England's best known for its, revolutionary acts, it's the formation of its colonial history, but who are these seekers and outliers? And if we start to put them together in a line themselves, is there an alternative and a different kind of history that New England could be known for? At the time, I was reading two books, and I think of these two books very much in relation to the formation of these ideas. The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, which is a sort of historic biography, telling of the German naturalist who's considered the father of modern ecology. So he conceived of a notion of the natural world as deeply interconnected, that all natural phenomena and from the most micro scale to the macro scale relate to each other and must have this connection to each other, which wasn't necessarily how a lot of other people were thinking at the time who were concerned with natural study. To us, that seems pretty that's not so surprising, but Humboldt's idea is sort of foundational to that. And then on the right, you see the cover of a really fabulous book called Paradise Now, The Story of American Utopianism. Both I would highly recommend if you're looking for new quarantine reading. And this is a book about the periods of time I was talking about in the 19th century when utopian fever kind of swept the United States, and in particular the New England area. Sort of in the wake of the industrial period, prior to the Civil War, so a lot of race relation, searching for gender equity, and despair about industrialism and what it's doing to the human condition come out, and people are seeking alternative traditions, ways of living, and that's the premise of this really fabulously written book. And so as I came back from this beautiful setting, like nature itself, of course, is a restorative, creative place. It allows you to find some space to start thinking and make a plan. I started making day trips on my weekends and just time that I had to places, sites that I became interested in, like Fruitlands for the first time, and Brook Farm, which if you go now does not look like this with a beautiful rainbow above it, but it's in fact quite dilapidated, strange state. But each of these places exists. In addition to those two examples, there was another association, the Northampton Association of Agriculture and Education, that was formed in the 1840s as a kind of utopian communal living organization that was visited and joined by major activists of abolitionism, including Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass as well. So many of the thinkers connected or founders connected to these movements were strongly advocating for equal rights and women's rights and gender equity as well. So Margaret Fuller, who was not actually an official member of Brook Farm, but she had a cabin connected to Brook Farm, not far from the buildings that were the main property. So she's connected. So this idea of social reform is important to these communities, but also a connection to nature. And so transcendentalist philosophy is key to the thinking of these organizations as well. So images and writings such as Emerson's Nature, in which he describes himself, I'll read this out loud, standing on the bare ground, head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite spaces, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. And I just love this hilarious caricature of Emerson walking through the landscape as this unfiltered, like raw nerve of it, or of his eyeball, and that he feels the currents of the universe. So that connection that I was thinking about in connection to Alexander Humboldt, that you are one with nature, essentially, is written about by Emerson, and also talked about by many of the people who are connected to some of these utopian communities. So as those utopian communities, as admirably idealistic as they were, they all fail for different reasons. They also never quite, even in their time that they are in formation, they never quite achieve equity of race or gender either. But some of the ideas do continue onward. And so one of the ways you see that is with the formation of kind of summer retreats later in the 19th century into the 20th century, like a place like Greenacre in Elliott, Maine, founded by Boston-based Sarah Farmer, where she invited a lot of outside thinkers, artists, scientists, philosophers to convene, have these sort of intellectual conversations. They practiced yoga, they kind of met together as like an adult summer camp, I'd say. And that was this belief that you could do these things, talk about these things in nature, and then restore and come back to do your work. And there's also here where Marsden Hartley, and this is where art for me becomes key. So I was researching this history, but also realizing that artists were kind of dotting within it. And I wanted to kind of pull out who these artists were. So for example, Marsden Hartley worked at Greenacre in the summer of 1907. And it's where he credited sort of discovering the idea of mysticism in nature. And so that place, that sense of place, then affects an artist who then brings it forward in his own work. Marsden Hartley comes up again at a place. So I'm just sort of pointing out different places in New England that I feel like are connected to this history and how it moves through the area and through time. Marsden Hartley also visited Dogtown, which is in Cape Ann or near Gloucester. If you've not been, I recommend it. It is an abandoned settlement that by the 19th century was only really pitted with these huge boulders, formerly kind of agricultural, but also kind of a place where a lot of outliers lived. People who did not have a place in town, let's say, lived in the sort of relic or remains of a former settlement. So that by the time Marsden Hartley visited, the landscape looked like what you see on the right, completely barren, except for these huge lumbering boulders, some as big as small houses. And you can walk there now and still see these strange sort of animistic formations. And it's where Marsden Hartley again had this experience, returning 30 years later to the Massachusetts area and having the same mysticism of nature that he describes. And I'll just move a little more quickly. I'll actually finish up because I sort of wind my way through not only these histories of utopianism, but also spiritualist and healing practices that go outside regular medicinal therapies or psychotherapies, things like that. I think what I'll do is I'll just talk about one studio visit, because I wanted to mention that while I was doing that research, thinking through this, I was making a lot of studio visits, and I was visiting with artists for the biennial that was coming up, but also knowing there were artists who were, I thought, interesting that I could talk about in connection to these topics that were coming up. Caleb Charland is one of them, and so these are views from my studio visit with him. He lives up in Bangor, Maine. And one of the photos I saw in his in this visit was this piece called "Camera Placed on My Chest While Lying in the Night for More Than 2 Hours." And so this is a photograph. It looks almost like a seismograph, but it actually records the artist holding his camera, as he describes, open for 2 hours. So those streaks of white light that look like brush strokes or kind of a splatter of oil or something are actually stars or satellites that are moving with his own breath. And to me, this is a way in which his work directly connects back to someone like Emerson, who writes about being directly embodying nature. And I feel like Caleb's work does that. He himself becomes the camera. He becomes the camera's eyes on his body, looking up. It's completely unfiltered so that his breath is actually part of the night sky. And so I love this idea of finding that kind of immersion and sort of looping back. And so I did that repeatedly with each of these artists. I sort of found connections like this. And so I think what I'll do is I'll stop there because I can see that we are running out of time. I'd be happy to take questions or talk further. Just to show you a few images of the layout, which we're now at that point, we're trying to rethink the layout. But you see there in the center, big wall of Sam Durant's work, intro text that relates to the catalog. And lastly, the shaker furniture bench. So this has to do with an exhibition designer that we're working with. Once we're at the point of exhibition design and planning for the layout of the exhibition, I've had the opportunity to work with a designer who was inspired by shaker furniture to create the kind of vitrines that you see that will be in the exhibition. So the research I was doing then shared with a designer become the ways in which in physical form and through design will be expressed through the exhibition. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions. I know time is short too, so however you like.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So we do have a few questions. The first one is, are there artists from all 6 states of New England in this exhibition?
Yes, so there are. It was important to me that of course, is represented by claiming New England, Visionary New England as a title, that each state has its own history, so yes.
How did you define what visionary meant in this show?
So visionary to me does privilege sight, I think, through its definition, but seeing can be like a forward-looking. It can be something that applies that way. It can be an experience like an out-of-body experience, so a kind of hallucination, or when one is under a certain influence, that one can have a visionary experience there. I was thinking of visionaries, of course, of people who are promoting ideas that are maybe less accepted in their time, but then become recognized later. And so that idea of someone like that, who are those people and how do we think of them now? But I think in this case with this exhibition, I was less thinking about like a techno-utopianism, so that technology is not the thing that is solving the society's ills. It's more about other means of societies in formation and a strong connection to nature, as opposed to, the ideas that we can solve this by more technology, which is often how you talk about utopian or visionary activities.
Okay, and how are you planning to help people know about the museum collaboration amongst deCordova, Fitchburg, and Fruitlands?
So that'll come up. I mean, we're reworking that because each exhibition now is closed and we're figuring out the dates and deadlines for those or when they'll reopen. But we are at the very least, originally they were all going to be opening at the same time, and we had a media plan and a kind of programming plan. We will do some Zoom events with the 3 curators and some of the artists whose work is in all 3 or at least 2 exhibitions each. We have other ways through interviews and other ways that we're talking about it. And then we want to figure out ideally a way for visitors who come to one exhibition to get like a pass to go to Fruitlands, or kind of almost like a passport book, kind of to encourage people to travel to each, because they are in proximity to each other. And it was on my mind to come up with an exhibition, or it's been on my mind, like the strength of deCordova is that we are not in the city, and so often we talk about deCordova being so close to Boston, and isn't that great? And it is, but in this case I wanted to come up with an initiative that strengthened greater Boston-ness, like west of 95 and so forth. And so these 3 places, when you put us together, we actually do have a lot of things going on together, and so that to me became really interesting to try to emphasize.
All right, and we have a couple more. think we do have time to cover them quickly.
Sure.
When the aesthetics of the designer of an exhibit conflict with the ideas of the curator about relationships of the objects, who wins, or does that happen?
Love it. That always comes up in my experience because a designer is an artist, and that is so they will want to. In the best case, a designer we will have a conversation or a few conversations even before they propose multiple proposals, usually about the overall look of the fonts and the things like that. And hopefully by that point, I've shared my information, like types of work and ideas, just like broad ideas that it will line up. But sometimes, at least in my experience, sometimes the design goes overboard and it takes over the experience of the art, and it kind of like gets in the way. And to me, design, it's not that design should be invisible, but it should just like feel really natural. And so I work on that. And because we in the museum, we produce this, we make the final call basically in terms of the production, the scale, all of these things, we're paying for these things. Ideally those things will feel resolved. But yeah, I'm glad for that question.
All right, and then the last question, and then you guys can wrap it up. How many artists are featured in Visionary New England, and will there be a catalog available?
Yes, so there is a catalog. It's actually already listed on Amazon. If it's not for sale yet, it's maybe pre-listed. It's on MIT's website, and we have received, I actually have a physical copy here. So we've received the copies because this show was supposed to open in April, but because of the delays, now it's ideally opening in October, but everything is still being worked out. So yeah, so the catalog I would love for people to buy and to have as a record. And then the number of artists is kind of hard to answer. There are 10 contemporary artists, but then there are a number of artists from historic periods. So I haven't really added that up. There's way more once you start to add up those makers. But really it's the 10 living artists who I define as the 10 from the show.
All right, well, I'm just going to jump in here. We've come to our closing time. I want to thank Sarah for taking us behind the scenes into the organizing of this wonderful exhibition, and also just for all the great work that you do, Sarah, for deCordova and the trustees. Mm-hmm. Also, thank you, Javon, Michael, and Annika for your organizing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Delighted to spend time with you. And I hope you'll join us for next week's webinar, which is on protecting in perpetuity land conservation updates and opportunity. And this is with Rob Warren, who is the trustee's managing director of land conservation, and also with David Santomena, who is the associate director of land conservation. And they'll just be discussing the ways that the trustees identifies and evaluates new land conservation opportunities. So with that, I will sign off for all of us and wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.